Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first cafe talk of the semester. I'm Victoria Van Heining, an assistant professor in the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland, and the new director of the Center for Archival Futures, also known as CAFE. The center was established in 2021 by a group of interdisciplinary researchers from Info and beyond. Through innovative research, education, experiential learning, and partnership building, we develop human-centered and automated approaches to understanding the use and care for digital archives over time. We take a holistic view of digital curation as a research area, education domain, and growing profession that transcends disciplines and organizational contexts. We endeavor to advance cultural equity and accessibility, ultimately ensuring the preservation of our shared cultural heritage for future generations. One of those sentences was written by ChatGPT, and 10 points if you can guess which one. The speaker series is our flagship. It's normally held on the first Wednesday of each month during the semester. But for September, we tend to get a later start to give everybody time to find their feet in the new year. We host speakers who are at the cutting edge of archives and digital curation research and practice in a wide variety of institutions and contexts. And you can find recordings of our previous illustrious guest speakers at the CAFE event page, which my colleague will share in the chat. Today, we're beaming in from College Park, Maryland, which is located on the ancestral territories of the Piscataway, Nacotchtank, and their indigenous kin and neighbors. As members of the University of Maryland, we acknowledge as a land-grant university the 202,000 acres of stolen indigenous land taken and distributed to the university under the Morrill Act in 1862. We want to acknowledge the separation that these and many other acts of colonialism, assimilation, and genocide, which include archival collecting, generated between indigenous peoples and their homelands. We honor the continued power and resilience of indigenous communities and nations, and celebrate the collaborative and decolonizing work now taking place in our collections and institutions. We further acknowledge the University of Maryland's connections to slavery and to generations of racialized trauma rooted in this institution. As a member college of universities studying slavery, or USS, the University of Maryland has undertaken the 1856 Project, which is committed to investigating and illuminating these histories. So before I introduce Ben and Sara Brumfield, our speakers today, I have some exciting news. We are hiring a full-time professional track lecturer in the area of digital curation and archives, and my colleague will share that link in the chat. This hire replaces the outgoing Associate Director of CAFE, Travis Wagner, who's taken up a new tenure track position at the University of Illinois. Congratulations, Travis. So, Ben and Sara are the creators of FromThePage, which is a crowdsourcing and collaboration platform for transcription and metadata enhancement. Enthusiastic technologists, they've been exploring and experimenting with AI for years, and particularly over the last year. They've generously documented so much of their development and their thinking about crowdsourcing and emerging technologies over the years through their accompanying blog. And we're going to share those links to the FromThePage site. And also, I think Ben and Sara, if it's okay, you wanted to plug that you are hosting your own talk about Whisper AI tomorrow. Is that right?
Yeah, mostly because we'll be mentioning it today. So in case you want more, I just wanted to make sure we had that link at some point in the notes.
Excellent. So we can keep dropping relevant links. And I just want to say it's such a pleasure and an honor to have Ben and Sara speaking with us today. I've known Ben for probably going on 10 years, and they've both just been so incredibly passionate and generous and so smart about the work that they do, and just really attentive to the needs of those of us working in cultural heritage and academia and communities, and their work's really an inspiration. So over to you to tell us about AI and emerging practice at your at your end.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
So we are sharing our screen.
Can everyone see that? Yes, great. So today we're here to talk about 10 ways AI will change archives. We're going to cover 10 things: improving accessibility, extracting entities, matching entities, describing items, improving discovery, interacting with archives, creating text from handwriting, enhancing dirty text, and transcribing our AV material and changing archival workflows. So that's kind of our agenda for today. I like to start a lot of my AI talks with this quote. I think Bill Gates has been around for a very long time and is a very seasoned technologist. He really can see the long term, and he sees AI as fundamental as the creation of the microprocessor, the computer, the internet, the mobile phone. Everything is going to change because of AI. I like to tell myself, and ask myself, is there a scenario in the future that doesn't involve AI? I don't think that our professional future doesn't involve AI. So we all have a responsibility to learn and to think about how it works, what it means.
Okay, so let's jump into the first way that we see AI changing archives. So Sarah and I focus on the technical applications of AI to archival material. So we'll talk about some very concrete use cases that we see applying to archival work. And a lot of this is the result of experiments that we have either performed ourselves or our colleagues have worked on and we've kind of covered. So the first one of these ways we see changes happening is by improving accessibility. So let's dive into a concrete example. This is a letter hosted on the Folger Shakespeare Library's Early Modern Manuscripts online platform. And you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, it's been transcribed diplomatically. So the original spellings, punctuation, and abbreviations, those have all been retained. So knowing that that's not very accessible to a modern reader, the staff of the Folger have also created a regularized version of the document that retains most of the original wording, but it expands the abbreviations and brings the spelling up to the modern standards. So this regularized form is really useful for visually impaired users, like people with screen readers, which really struggle with abbreviations or non-standard punctuation especially. But it's also, these regularized spellings are also useful for anyone performing a full text search. So large language models like ChatGPT are very bad at some things, but they are very good at paraphrasing text. So we conducted a few experiments to see whether it could regularize diplomatic transcription. So we fed the text to ChatGPT, the diplomatic transcription, and compared its regularization of the text to the regularization performed by the staff at the Folger. All right, so on the left-hand side, you see the result of human experts doing this regularization. On the right-hand side, you see what ChatGPT did. I've got to say, the results are really good. Even if you look at the third from the bottom line, it got the abbreviation "Your Lordship," right? If we go back over here, this is really, LPS YOR, right? Expanding that to "Your Lordship" is very impressive. The wording is a little bit different from the version produced by the Folger, but the ChatGPT version would actually work a lot better for a screen reader. So this is pretty exciting because the process of regularizing these transcripts is a tedious one, and staff of the Folger have already been attempting to automate this.
And it's also interesting because once you realize you can create kind of an accessible version of this, that's great for screen readers and just for making it easy to read, then you can start thinking about other ways and other axes that you can think about accessibility, like a version that's aimed at an 8th grade reading level, for instance. There's a lot of possibilities here. One of the other things, our second idea, is using large language models to extract entities. So we did some experiments where we asked ChatGPT to identify the people named in a historical diary entry. This is from a project that we run on FromThePage. We have it transcribed. It's very terse. It's it's a Virginia tobacco farm diary, and it did a really good job identifying all the people in the entry. It actually even gave us context. Who were these people and what were they doing? Which is not exactly what I asked. So I actually asked it to go back and just simplify it, please, down to something that was just the names of the people.
You can imagine this, doing something like this to feed into creating finding aids or other online resources.
You can do exactly the same thing with places. I don't know how useful these places are, because the things that are referenced in this particular document are things like the schoolhouse or the mill, but it found them. And that's, I think, interesting in and of itself.
So that's great if you're working with raw text that you know nothing about. But what if you already have entities that are mentioned in a finding aid or an authority file? We ran an experiment yesterday working with the same farm diary. And the interesting thing about this that we had going for us is that a human had already tagged all the entities that are mentioned. So H and Jesse, or Mrs. Mosley, or Mr. Jonathan Hunt. So we were able to compare the result of the person who indexed this page to what ChatGPT might do.
So in AI, we call that ground truth, which is just a vocabulary word for
Right.
you.
So I extracted the human created entity names, and I just used the most common 100 across the entire corpus. And I thought it'd be interesting to pull in other information about them. So if they have been tagged as enslaved people or free people, if they were places, if they were companies, I pulled all those in. And so this is the prompt that I use. So after the word entities, I'll give you a list of entities and the category each entity belongs in. After the word text, I will provide the text of a page from the 19th century diary. Please identify the entities mentioned in the text using the values from the list. So this is just an experiment. One would hope that in the future, we might be able to actually connect to things like Library of Congress subject headings or a collection-specific authority file. So how did it do? Well, it did reasonably well, right? It extracted these people and it was able to match the ones that it saw in the plain text document to the ones that I provided it. The thing that I'm particularly pleased about is if you look at line 6 or line 8 or line 9, you see these examples where it says, well, this person isn't actually in the list you gave me, but it could be this other thing. And it's correct for number 6, Dr. Thompson. It provides 2 alternatives for number 8. It does a great job on 9, and on 13, it is able to find, 13, it does something kind of weird because it can tell something as a place, but it doesn't quite provide it as a match. The only thing that it really messed up was Yates's Mill, which was in a list of places, but it assumed that Mill Yates is an entity someone whose first name is Mill and last name is Yates. But you can see the power to take perhaps existing finding aids and existing resources like authority files and to be able to create page-specific or sentence-specific linkages between the people who are listed there and the documents in which they appear.
So item number 4, describing items. Next slide. So Matt Miller at the Library of Congress did a series of experiments with the Susan B. Anthony collection, which has been transcribed already. And one of the things he asked the GPT APIs to do was summarize each letter in the collection. And that's what you see on the screen here. But he did a couple of variations. The first screenshot was a single sentence summary, but this screenshot shows a 4-sentence summary. And the slider on the right, actually, that lets you play with how many sentences you want in the summary. I think this is really fascinating. We also were just reading some information about how to get more dense summaries out of the GPT APIs, because that's an interesting idea too. How do you make sure that all the important entities are included in a summary and kind of get the summary centered around those entities? So I think this has almost immediate applications to archives. I also point out that the line between some of the accessible versions of the text that Ben talked about with the Folger example earlier, and these summaries, it actually starts getting a little bit blurry. When does a simplified variant become a summary? What's the line? It's kind of interesting.
So let's talk a little bit about improving discovery. And we think improving discovery can be done in a lot of ways. So one of the things that we tried to do was provide a list of tags to describe different collections. So we host about 1,000 different projects on FromThePage. Each one of them has a description that is provided by generally the archivist or librarian who uploaded it. But there's no connection between something that might have been uploaded by University of Maryland and something uploaded by Maryland State Archives. So we need kind of a global set of subjects to let users find projects. So this is the prompt that we used. And this is, I should back up and say that we had already classified about 1,000 of these projects with the help of an archivist who was doing this work for us. And so we were able to compare the results of a ChatGPT classification with the classification by an archivist. So this is an example where you can see the text that we fed in. Join us in identifying items. We're asking for help identifying park photographs. And ChatGPT was able to come up with the tags parks, photographs, and images in 19th century. The archivist was able to do the same thing. They did not add 19th century.
Because these pictures are actually not from the 19th century.
Right. So you always need some human review.
Well, and what's interesting about that one, because it shows up in this example too, these models, they love the dates. They kind of over attach to the dates, which is interesting to us. What we ended up doing with this was separating out the prompt and having anything to do with the date as a separate process.
Right.
Because we couldn't get it to do this right.
Yes,
right. It's like if there was a date.
It would add dates no matter what.
Yeah.
Similarly, if you compare the results of this collection of photographs by a professor at Carleton University during travels in China, ChatGPT was able to add the tags of China, 20th century photographs. These are perfect. They're actually a little bit better than the ones created by the archivist who did not tag this with China. Except
that the archivist was told we want tags that have 3 projects.
Yes.
Right? We kind of wanted a controlled vocabulary that had enough representation in this corpus of collections that we'd have more than one collection. And ChatGPT was happy to ignore our list if it thought that there was something that was a better category, which there was. So again, there needs to be some human intervention, both in defining what you want and then reviewing what comes out of it.
So there's some sort of tagging and classification examples.
But there's also some interesting examples about a kind of search, but it's a different type of search than what we're used to. So we're back to the Susan B. Anthony papers. And this interface, you can highlight, and my screenshot didn't manage to catch this, but you can highlight a term from a letter, and then you can right click and you can do search similar text. And if you do that, next slide, you'll see here that we highlighted Political Equality Club. And the first 2 things that are returned actually both mention the Political Equality Club. And you're like, okay, yes, that's just search, right? We've been doing search for decades. But it actually isn't a textual search in the traditional way we think of it. It is kind of a semantic search. It looks for concepts that are similar to Political Equality Club. And if we hit the next slide, I did the same search with the word Catholic from a letter that was a little bit later in the list. And if you look on the left, it's really kind of fascinating to see what matched to the word Catholic. The first entry mentions Sister Mary, which is Susan B. Anthony's way of referring to a comrade, right? But not necessarily a Catholic sister, but I'm guessing that's kind of how it kind of skewed in that direction. It mentions church, which is great. It mentions the word Orthodox, mentions sermons. All of those things are kind of conceptually near the word Catholic. The second one, we have the word sister again. We have the word religionist, church. So again, similar. By the third one, nope, It takes the fourth one before we actually get a mention of, Roman Catholic, which is what we kind of, if we were doing a traditional search, what we'd expect to have come up first. And the fourth one is interesting because it actually mentions Catholic schools and a priest and some other things that actually start matching what our understanding of kind of Catholic as a concept. So I think this is a really great example of how these large language models think about concepts. It's a great big matrix with a whole bunch of concepts all next to each other, and it says what's close to this, and how do all these other documents fit that's close, and what's the closest of those. Matt also did a view similar text over here on the left that I have kind of highlighted in red, and it's the same as if you selected the entire letter to match on. It's asking find me similar letters. Go to the next slide. So here's the results from that. I actually didn't find this to be very compelling. I think if I was trying to get at this, I might ask for entities that were mentioned and then try to match on those entities and maybe get something closer. But full text letters, looking for documents that are similar to another document. Yeah, I didn't really see the patterns here. It was maybe too broad of an ask.
So another interesting thing that we might be able to do is look for particular kinds of people or particular documents by classifying them based on their contents. So here's an example in which, again, we're going back to the Jeremiah Graves paper, the farm diary. We want to know what are the pages that mentioned people who are enslaved, right? That's one of the things that we're studying. And asking something like ChatGPT this question, are enslaved people mentioned in these entries? It got a really good response. And if you can imagine the kinds of legal documents from the 19th century that the archives we work with have, they're a lot of them are
state archives.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
So we work with, they're dry as dust, Supreme Court rulings and court testimonies and things. And you really want to serve descendant communities by pointing them to the materials that are most important. And this might be a way to surface those without having to have humans read and classify thousands of pages of legalese.
So our sixth idea of how AI is going to change archives is it's going to change how people interact with the archives. So one of the experiments we've been doing is called a semantic search bot. You actually see this online. I'm seeing a lot of emerging search bots around podcast transcripts or newsletter archives. And it works kind of, we built this based on the same technology. So you are introduced, hey, this is a search bot. Ask me a question about the Jeremiah White Graves diaries. So I asked it, when did the children go to school? And what it returns is the entry that is closest conceptually, so very similar to the Susan B. Anthony work that we were doing, to the question, when did the children go to school? And then actually, if you'll go to the next slide, what we do is we take that text, the primary source text that was closest to the question, and we take the question, and we take this prompt, which basically says, you're a historian, analyzing the transcription of a primary source document, describe the document, and you'll be provided with a page of text, and you'll be provided with a question. You'll answer the question based on the page and what can be inferred from the page. Please answer pleasantly and accurately. If the question cannot be determined or inferred from the page text, please respond, I'm sorry, I do not know. And so you can kind of package those three things up, the question, the text, and the prompt, and send it to the GPT APIs. And if you want to go back, when it comes back with a question, or sorry, an answer to the question that is kind of a summary from that material. This is still pretty rudimentary. We were doing it as a proof of concept. What we really want to do is to be able to take, break these pages down into individual diary entries. And instead of just feeding it one, feed it maybe the 5 or the 10 that are closest to the question. There's also kind of a bootstrapping problem here in that it's really hard to ask questions of an archival collection that you don't know. Like there's lots of things to ask of this, but if you are just staring at a prompt it's really hard. So thinking about the interface and how do we kind of tell people enough about the collection that they can start asking interesting questions is going to be, I think, a really fascinating area.
So another role for AI is creating text from handwriting. So handwritten documents, I think we all know, there's been efforts to scan them for the last 40 years, and lots of scans are online, but you can't do a Control F search, right? Google can't index them. It's very hard to pull text out.
That's why we exist from the page.
That's right. Yeah, generally you need humans to do this. So over the last, I want to say, 8 years, a technology called handwritten text recognition has advanced to the point at which it's pretty good. So let's walk through the results of an AI-driven transcription of this document. This is a letter hosted by our friends at the State Library of Queensland. It's the Colonial Secretary Correspondence. And they were able to provide us this and provide us the output of an HTR process. So if you take this document and you run it through an HTR process, you get text back that is bad, but it's not terrible. This is the kind of thing that might be something you could extract dates from, like July 29th. You might be able to do a full text search against this, looking for the word provisions. Let's compare this result with what we got out of a human transcribing it. So the HTR, handwritten text recognition text, the AI transcribed text is on the left. The human transcribed text is on the right. And I want to say that maybe 6 out of 10 words are actually correct. It is unfortunate that very few of those words are entities. It got the name of the ship wrong. It got the name of Newcastle wrong. It got northwards wrong. That's kind of a challenge, but that's kind of where we are. There's something to work with here. How can we enhance this? So there's this open question. All right, if you have this kind of dirty text, this raw HTR text,
or even OCR,
text, can you use AI to improve it? So I tried to use that example and run it through ChatGPT to clean up the bad text. All right, and here's the prompt that I used. And as you saw with some of Sarah's prompts, it's very important with these large language models to give the AI a role to play, right? Its role playing is super important. So I said, you're a historian reading a 19th century correspondence to the British colonial secretary. So you're adding more context here as well. And you're explaining stuff about it, what it's going to see, right? The text has many errors. You can correct many of these errors to produce a better version of the text. So how did it do? Well, so it actually did a pretty good job of correcting typos, right? It got excellency in the first line correct. It got excellency in the third line correct. It corrected ravens in the second paragraph to having, which is correct, right? Ravens is not useful. And it got Newcastle right too. That said, there are some things that got really wrong. So the name of the ship is the Snapper on line 2. It translated that as to the Harappan. If you look at the very last word, if you remember the original, that was northward. It translated that as to northeast. So if you compare the ChatGPT corrections with the human corrections, one of the things you see is there is kind of this garbage in, garbage out process, where if the HTR text is pretty bad, right, the AIs can't invent things that are going to correct them. The peril is that the AIs will invent things to correct them, right? I even gave in my prompt, I gave the AI a bailout free clause saying, if you can't figure it out, just use question marks here. It didn't do that. It gave us a plausible text that was also a wrong text. So half of its corrections were actually correct. The other half were wrong, but were silently wrong. So we get northwards instead of northeast. And I don't know about you, but I would be much more likely to do research if I was curious about the direction. If I saw the word North Sud, which doesn't make any sense. Oh, what is that? Let's go back and look at the original document. Than I would if I saw northeast. Northeast looks too plausible.
Yeah, and it's a challenge because when you look at this, like, I don't think I would show a researcher HTR text. I might show someone on a crowdsourcing platform like FromThePage that HTR text and we're brainstorming ways of using it as an assist because it gets things that humans have a lot of trouble getting sometimes. But I do think you can use the ChatGPT corrected versions of HTR, or maybe not. Maybe you can just skip that piece to ask questions like, is an enslaved person mentioned on this page? And that's where it gets really interesting because yes, it will miss some things. It will get some things wrong. But if you have something that helps you surface the interesting pages that you really want to concentrate on and work on, then I think that's a win.
Yeah. It remains to be seen whether, there's promise here. There's also peril here, I think.
Yeah, we run a crowdsourcing platform. We really believe in collaboration and humans, and really we believe in passionate volunteers who have this real drive to contribute to history and are genealogists and really want to work to improve the data that genealogists use to do their research. And so a lot of our thinking right now is, how can we use all these strategies and these tools to help them? Or how can we use those volunteers, those really passionate volunteers, to check this?
Yeah.
Maybe? Like, we don't know.
Yes.
This is the open, interesting questions that we're grappling with.
But as you can see, we definitely do not want to replace humans with the result of cleaned HTR. That's not going to be good.
One of the other things we are super, super excited about is using AI for transcribing audiovisual material. So we do a project with Professor Tanya Clement at the University of Texas. It's called AV Annotate, Mellon funded project. And through that, we've learned just how much AV material is really, really locked away in archives. There's permissions issues with publishing it. There's preservation is this stuff is on plastic and it's having problems and it's going to get worse. And so anything that we can do that makes this AV material more useful, makes it better to, makes it more, changes the equation on whether we bother to preserve it, because people start using it more. And we want people to be able to find things. And you have a 3-hour-long recording and you only want to find 15 minutes where they mention someone or interview someone that you're interested in. That is terribly time consuming and terribly hard to do. But we think this is going to be a really fascinating and game-changing approach. So the next 2 slides I have are actually from our friend Will Hicks at the University of North Texas. We haven't run these experiments, but he has. And what's interesting about this work is it uses Whisper AI, which is another tool by OpenAI like ChatGPT or the GPT APIs, but it's actually available to download and you can run it on your own computers. Now, those computer requirements are actually pretty hefty. Will diverted some new large gaming computers that they had coming in and used those for a couple of weeks for these experiments and working with some of his archival material. But the first example is a recording that features jazz musician Louis Armstrong, and he has a beautiful but very difficult to transcribe voice. And it took Will's student days to transcribe this recording, which is kind of what you see at the top, and yet it still has errors. The middle is another automated program for kind of comparison, and at the bottom is Whisper's unedited output via the large language model. The error rate for the human and Whisper AI was about equal, but unlike weeks to transcribe it, Whisper finished this file in a couple of minutes. And if you're interested in this, you should sign up for the webinar Will's doing with us tomorrow, because this is one of the slides that I pulled from 60 slides that he has. The next slide And this is an example to kind of talk about the cost savings aspects of this. So this recording was a Spanish language interview, and they paid a vendor to transcribe it. It's 51 minutes long, and it cost them $222. And they got the file back 9 days after they submitted it. They couldn't actually justify translating it, which would have run between $500 and $1,200, depending on kind of accuracy and pricing. So instead, for comparison purposes, they ran it through Whisper AI. It was done on the same day. The translation is readable. And for the transcript, Will ran a diff against the text, and it's like 90% the same as the human edit. And most of those differences are just formatting of numbers, contractions, lost punctuation, maybe a little bit of spelling differences and names and things. It's way better than nothing. From Will's perspective, it's definitely worth it. So I think this is going to be kind of a game changer.
And if I can interrupt, one of the things that we're really excited about with one of the things we're really excited about with AI-based tools like Whisper is that there are things that humans are great at, and there are things that humans really do not enjoy. And if you're thinking about creating an audio or audio-visual transcript, you're listening to the people, you are trying to figure out what they're saying, you're trying to understand them, but you're also recording the timestamps for each one of these passages. And recording timestamps is awful. It's error prone. Computers are great at that. They're not so great at the actual text, though they're getting pretty decent. But if you can get a computer to do that work that none of us want to do, then that is a real victory, I feel like.
So our final example of how AI is changing the archives world is that it's changing archival workflows. So when we started From the Page, and that was 18 years ago, we expected folks to have digitized material already, right? Most of us have digitized material, probably in a DAMS, with some metadata, and then to import that into From the Page for crowdsourcing. And what we found is that's not true. Folks are digitizing material because they want the engagement that comes from crowdsourcing projects. So they're like, we want to do a crowdsourcing project, let's go digitize the right material for it. And then they ingest it into their systems with the metadata that's provided by that crowdsourcing. So sort of start with the project, digitize your material, transcribe it, and then only then do you start ingesting it. And none of that has to do with AI, but if you think about all the ideas that we've presented today, you've got to start with digitization, right? Kind of have to start there. But then we think you'll have to transcribe, either with humans or with machines, or maybe a combination of both. So you have inputs to these automated processes that will help you describe those documents. And then only after you've generated all that data, and it's a lot of derivative data that our current systems are not good at managing, searching, displaying. I know Victoria thinks about this a whole lot. Only then will you ingest it into those downstream access and preservation systems. So it's going to be a big challenge. We're going to have to rethink our systems as well as our processes, and search becomes a much bigger problem and a much bigger opportunity. So we're really excited about all these changes because we love technology and we love increasing access to archival material. And we hope you are too.
So we can wrap up there.
Great, thank you both. I will remove the pen for the moment. And I think I didn't say at the outset, but if anybody would like to go and catch this talk as a recording, we'll be making it available on our iSchool events page, hopefully in around a week. If you just keep an eye on that link, that will be forthcoming. And if anybody has any questions that they either want to put in the chat and that I can then read out, please do. And otherwise, we can open the floor, raise your hand, and you can unmute when I call on you. And while people are gathering their thoughts, Ben and Sarah, you typically record your webinars as well, right? So those would be available as well
Yeah.
if folks can't make that tomorrow.
We'll actually drop in a link to our YouTube channel, which is where we put all of our stuff. And there's a whole AI playlist there of things we've done over the last
Year.
6 months, year. Yeah. Mhm.
Awesome. Well, I see a hand. Laura, go for it.
Hi. So first off, thank you very much for this presentation. It was really informative. One thing that caught my attention right at the start is when you said that AI could be used for accessibility purposes, such as translating early modern English into modern English so that screen readers know what they're looking at. My concern with that is I've done very entry-level accessibility work before, and it's been proven that those accessibility plugin apps like Accessibility and things like that tend to actually create more accessibility issues because they break the website or they alter the formatting of things that were already accessible, et cetera, and so forth. Is there a concern of that sort of thing happening if you use ChatGPT for accessibility purposes or other AI? And if that has been thought about, have there been thoughts about ways to mitigate or fix that kind of problem?
I feel like the real question is, where in the pipeline do you apply this kind of regularization? And there are a couple of different places, and I feel like there's about 3. One of them that I think may be what happens first is that screen reading tools and accessibility applications themselves might add paraphrase options that use large language models to regularize these kinds of texts, so that they so that because the people running those actually have the needs of the end users in mind, right? That they are not going to do that wrong. The fear is that they're going to do the archival side of things wrong.
I was going to say, it took us a lot of iterations to get that prompt right for getting ChatGPT to produce the regularized version. I mean, we had to give it role playing that made it an academic who was the kind of a similar person to what the professionals at the Folger are, in order to, to put it to give it conceptually the right space to be able to say LPS is lordship, which when you say early modern becomes more obvious, but when you're just reading stuff on the internet, maybe not. But what are the other places?
Oh, the other
Yes.
places, doing it by the libraries and archives themselves. And if you put that accessible text in a place that is accessible to anyone, right? I mean, we all know that like making things more accessible helps accessibility for everyone, not just people using screen readers. Then I think that that would be the ideal solution. But I don't know yet where we're going to end up.
And in our experience, so few archival systems have places to put full text transcripts. Victoria can chime in on that because I know she asks a lot of people about whether they have places to put them. And so, once you start adding more and more derivatives, where do you put them and how do you make them accessible to people? Accessible even just as, where do you put them so they can find them, right? So
I'm sorry, I understood the second half of that. You said putting in the accessibility tech in the screen readers first might do what?
Putting it in the screen readers first might not serve, like the people running the screen readers understand their needs, but they don't necessarily understand historic documents or historic texts. So you might end up with bad history that's very accessible.
Or you might not be able to take an LPS and figure out that it really should be said lordship.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for your question, and we will definitely chat more. I'm glad you're interested in this. I'm going to move on to a question from Martin. Oh, just saying thank you for the excellent presentation. A question from Pooja. Pooja, did you want to ask this question or would you like me to ask it? I will take that as I should ask it. Okay. Have you noticed a visible difference in the quality of responses when you do not assign a role to the AI?
Absolutely, 100%. I actually, I'm going to be opinionated. And Victoria, are your students taking classes on prompt writing? Because I think anyone with an information science degree should be studying how to do this. I don't think that we're all going to be interacting with these large language models with prompts in the future, not the general public. I think there'll be lots of other ways that we interact with them, like, you know, highlight a term and look for similar documents, things like that. But I think information professionals will need to know how to do this. And role playing is one of the biggest levers that we have found. Context is the other one. And if you go look at our YouTube channel, we have a webinar on prompt writing there, and there's lots of resources online. But yeah, you guys should, everyone
Yes.
should learn how to do this.
I feel like this definitely falls within a reference librarian's roles, like
Skills,
starting now.
Yeah.
So we've got our next cafe event teed up then. we haven't actually planned a prompt writing day, but that sounds like a great thing to do.
Yeah.
And I'm curious for those on the call if you have encountered this in your classes or started teaching prompt writing. I see a question from Mason, who I think had to step away. What are the potential impacts of running tagged data through AI to inform description on a corpus level, which I guess is in distinction to the item or sentence or page level?
You know, I think if I was building corpus description, I might start at the smallest level and slowly like build a description for a page or a letter or a document, build a description for and then take all of those descriptions and work on summarizing them in a way that covers most of what. And I think there's ways to do that using kind of prompts and thinking about how to use the large language models to do summary and to capture as much of the meaningful data
Yes, you
from
could.
those
I mean,
summaries
the
as
big challenge we
possible.
have right now is that the context windows, the amount of text you can feed one of these large language models is really short. Like it's 8,000 words or something like that. And so you can't analyze a whole corpus yet.
So you're going to have to go through an iterative process to get there. And that's actually a lot of what you see when you start digging into the more complicated GPT prompts is they're iterative.
We have a question from Adam. If you have photos, can the AI distinguish a photo and put a label that is recognizable on it?
Yes. Different models than the
different
ones
tools. Yeah, not large language models, but
I think Stable Diffusion has a describe command, so you can hand it a picture and ask it to describe it. And the thing that's fun to realize about, you've probably seen the AI image generation pieces. A lot of the training data for those was online images and their alt text. So you're actually asking it to do the opposite of what it's been trained on, which it means it will be very, very good at it. Because that's exactly
back to accessibility.
Yes.
Creating alt text, it turns out it's
very good at, yeah.
And I'll maybe ask a clarifying question that came up for me with that, which is, I don't know if Adam's thinking whether you have photos that are in, so let's say you have a scrapbook and you have handwritten text and then there are some photos interspersed, whether the model that you've played around with would be able to say, okay, well, there's like this different kind of image here that doesn't seem to be textual.
It sounds like a really interesting experiment. It's not something we've tried yet.
And to me, that's very much layout analysis, and there are tools that do layout analysis pretty well, but
find all the illustrations in this book. Those kinds of things people have done.
Yeah.
And we
haven't really played with that. Yeah.
Okay. JS, can you feed ChatGPT something like a controlled vocabulary and tell it to use it to analyze text to match words in a document with those controlled terms? Or is ChatGPT just making its analysis on whatever existing knowledge base it already has access to?
This is very similar to what we were trying to do with the collection description tagging. And so, yes, we actually fed it, here's this list of tags, and then here's this text, please tag based on this.
I also think it's very similar to the entity matching you were
Oh,
showing
yes, yeah.
too, right?
So you can do that, but it cheats, right? It will come up with things that are not in your list. And you have to tell it 3 times, do not add terms not in the list,
And it
do
will
not
still
make
be,
things up,
yeah.
and it still will cheat.
You need a human to review.
Yeah.
For sure.
Our next question, I think, is a two-parter. Is there a way to configure a ChatGPT API into a virtual archive as part of the system? And Sarah, you might need to clarify that one.
Yeah, well, I think so. An API is an application programming interface, which is if you're writing a program, that's how you talk to the same models that ChatGPT uses. They're actually, so they're called GPT 3.5 or GPT 4. Yes, that could be done, but you would need to do it as a way, you need to have a task in mind. And really how I'm envisioning most of this, but maybe I'm wrong, is that you kind of run these as jobs. You're like, okay, we have this page, have this letter, please summarize it for me. And then you take the summary and you put it in your database and you display it. But I do think there are things like the semantic search bot that I showed, those take kind of live interfaces to the GPT API. So I think we'll start seeing those show up someplace somehow. I don't know, but yes, then that's where you'll see actual GPT API interfaces around archival collections.
And there was a request for the name of the YouTube channel. We can also paste it in again, perhaps, or
actually, it was in my clipboard.
Oh, okay. Christina asks, what are some of the ethical implications or challenges you've discovered or run into, and how do we begin to think to train ethical use of AI in the archives for future students? And a +1 to that question.
So we are not spending a lot of time thinking through these issues. There are a lot of people out there who are spending a lot more time than we are on this. We're practitioners. We really like to think about how do you implement and use. So I would encourage you to go find some of those people and read what they have to say. I have a handful of comments on things that we've observed. Okay, so one of the first questions that comes up is, should archives let their material be, used in or crawled by the for training these large language models? So I'm going to point out that I have been in the room many times when the discussion goes like this: how do we get Google to index this thing, right? And if you have ever asked that about your archival collection, you want Google to be able to index it so people can find it, then I think you're going to want the large language models to be looking at your material. Now, that being said, the way these large language models work is basically kind of on statistics and how often different concepts and words and things show up. So the likelihood that the large language model actually can use in a way that's meaningful, and I don't even know what that means, a crawled archival document is questionable. I think archives will still have a very strong place as the place of record for research that is dependable and serious and targeted. My ancestor lived here, I want to go read the original correspondence between these two people. Those sorts of things, I think people will still come to the archive or the archive's website or whatever to answer those questions.
So we have seen examples of ethical, what you think of as ethical guardrails applied to particularly ChatGPT backfire for the purposes of historic research. And that doesn't mean they shouldn't be there at all. But if you think about the ethical guardrails about the things that ChatGPT will do, those ethical guardrails are fundamentally don't get OpenAI any bad press. So don't say racist things, don't say sexist things, don't do these other things. And so as a result, if you're trying to get it to summarize documents, we have a friend who was working with colonial Spanish documents, and it did a great job of everything except this one document that it refused to summarize. And it refused to summarize it because it mentioned inoculations. Well,
children.
And OpenAI doesn't want to get into trouble being thought of as an anti-vax tool, right? So it refused to work on this document. We've run into a lot of problems trying to get it to work with material about slavery. And, you understand that you don't want the AI to, spout off noises like, racist stuff. But if it can't help people who are researching slavery because of these guardrails, it may be of limited use.
Well, and I think the difference where we're going to maybe eventually end up is these general purpose large language models aren't going to be used for researching and analyzing 19th century documents. We're going to have to build new large language models that are based entirely on that corpus. And it's going to be fascinating when we do, because then they'll be able to speak like, and I'm going to put this in quotes because I don't actually believe these things think like the writers of the material that go into building it. There's a comment about hallucinations and how do you get it to stop inventing new terms. I will point out that the GPT-4 model is supposedly 40% less likely to hallucinate. So I do think it's improving. So hopefully there'll be less of that. But it just means it'll be more edge cases and harder to catch, right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
We're getting some more comments in the chat and motivation to upgrade to the latest version. Great. Well, I guess I have one final question, unless anybody wants to jump in. So I'll throw mine out, but if you type fast enough, you can cut in. And the question is, have you started to really have conversations, not with the users of FromThePage in the sense of the folks posting projects, but people starting to transcribe and think about their interactions with a potential chatbot or a potential, some layer. I know you already support OCR transcription. How do you think this might feel similar or different to users?
Yeah, I think what's in it. So the short answer is no, and we probably should. The long answer is we've had 2 calls, and I don't know why this would particularly be the case. 2 calls with Australian state archives in the last kind of week and a half or so, and they're thinking about this a lot more than anyone else we've talked to, which is kind of interesting because we've been talking to a lot of people who run projects on FromThePage about these different approaches and what makes sense to build. And one of them was the digital engagement team at New South Wales, and they really were like, okay, how do we make things better for the transcribers? How do we make it more fun? How do we make it, how do we use these technologies to get them over challenges? And we loved these questions and the way they were framing it, because we are a crowdsourcing platform. We really don't want to lose that. Like, we really believe in bringing meaningful work, both to the archives and to the volunteers. And for us, it's very meaningful. So that's it's informed a lot of our thinking about where we go with this. You want to talk about kind of the thing you want to build?
Yeah, well, we're kind of at time, but what we really want to do is, for our integrations, we want to put the humans in the center, right? AI people talk about humans in the loop, but that's not, humans are not just a component of tuning your AI. I think if this is not making our work a more pleasant and meaningful and engaging experience by eliminating the busy work of timestamps or regularization and letting us focus on the actual meaning, then then let's just say I'm a lot less enthusiastic.
But we do think there's lots of ways to take, say, HTR and let people check words they can't figure out and see if the machine has an alternative for them. Because it's very interesting, because often it does. The stuff we can't figure out, it can, and the stuff it doesn't figure out, well, humans can. So it's an interesting complement.
Very cool. Thank you both so much for a wonderful talk. I'm getting lots of enthusiastic notes here in the chat. So I will say to everybody, thank you so much for coming. Our next talk, we are actually going to confirm shortly whether we will be in person only or if it's going to be a hybrid event. But again, first Wednesdays of October, and we have exciting and thrilling events actually booked out through the spring of next year. And we'll be posting details and registration links on our events page, so keep an eye out for that. You can also sign up and learn more, keep up with what we're doing in Cafe. Again, go to our website and there's a subscribe link available. And Ben and Sarah, I'll keep the chat open, or keep the room open a little longer if anybody wants to jump in.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thanks.